Welcome to the Jewish Democratic Council of America's 8th Community Conversation on the Crisis in Israel. My name is Bobby Saferstein, and as the Senior Director of Programming and Public Engagement here at JDCA, I want to thank you for joining us for today's conversation with IKAR founder and Senior Rabbi Sharon Brous. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who was to join us today and sends his apologies, will instead join next week on Wednesday, December 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern, in conversation with Shalom Hartman Institute President Yehuda Kurtzer and acclaimed author and former President Obama speechwriter Sarah Hurwitz. The reason he's actually not able to join is he's in Philadelphia at Goldie's, which was recently targeted in anti-Semitic attacks. We hope you will join us and invite you to register at the link in the chat. It has now been 61 days since October 7th, when Hamas terrorists broke the existing ceasefire and carried out their brutal assault on Israel, murdering more than 1,200 people, taking more than 240 hostages, and raping, torturing, and decimating entire families and communities in their wake. Since that horrific day, we have shared in moments of hope with the release of over 100 hostages, the reunion of families, and the delivery of emergency aid to Palestinian civilians. And we thank President Biden and Democratic leadership for their critical role in negotiating the hostage release, temporary ceasefire, and extensions, and we eagerly await more to come. We have also supported each other through this period of despair, from the staggering loss of life in Gaza to the unprecedented rise in global anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents at rallies, on college campuses, and at Jewish-owned establishments, synagogues, and cemeteries. And we remain baffled at the absence and deafening silence of those allies and partners with whom we have marched and whose struggles we have supported. It is, to say the very least, not easy to be a Jew today. Here at JDCA, we talk a lot about values, Jewish values, democratic values, values such as Cherut, freedom and democracy, B'Tselem Elohim, dignity, equity, and equality, Tzedek Tirdof, the pursuit of justice, and of course, Ahavat Yisrael, peoplehood and community, just to name a few. As Jews and as Jewish Democrats, we cannot help but wrestle with what it means to live these values right now. How do we hold and reconcile the multitude of conflicting emotions and concerns we're challenged with? How can we advocate for the return of the 137 remaining hostages and also advocate for the humanitarian needs of innocent civilians in Gaza? How do we protect ourselves against the rise of anti-Semitism here and abroad, and also protect those from the rise of Islamophobia? And how do we show up for ourselves, our families, our communities, and even those who don't show up for us? For to be Jewish means to live these values wholly and completely, lest we become the very things we are fighting against. To help us make sense of all of this and how we continue to meet this moment, I can think of no better person than Rabbi Sharon Brous. To introduce our guest, I'm now delighted to invite JDCA board member and development committee chair, Ada Horwich. Ada, over to you.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you. As a proud JDCA board member coming to you from Los Angeles, I am thrilled to introduce everybody to my Rebbe, Sharon Brous. She's the founder and senior rabbi of IKAR, a Jewish community in Los Angeles, and actually around the world, because we do have members around the world. Among her many achievements, Rabbi Sharon, as we call her, spoke at President Obama and Vice President Biden's inaugural national prayer service in 2013, and she returned to do it again in 2021, blessing President Biden and Vice President Harris. She has led the White House Passover Seder with Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff and has been named #1 most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek and the Daily Beast. She continues to be recognized by the Forward and the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews. And her 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1.5 million people. Rabbi Brous has an upcoming book called The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Mend Our Broken Hearts and World, which makes the case that in an era of loneliness, social nation, and ideological extremism, our deepest spiritual work is finding our way to one another in celebration, in sorrow, and in solidarity. Since October 7th, Rabbi Sharon has remained one of the leading voices on the crisis in Israel and in Gaza, with the Times of Israel referring to her as one of the 3 American rabbis they trust right now. Just 2 weeks ago, the New York Times' Ezra Klein spoke with Rabbi Sharon on his podcast about Jewishness and Israel, referring to her words as the sermons I needed to hear right now. I think those of us who heard it would agree. Rabbi Brous, thank you so much for your work, your insight, and especially for joining us today in your busy life. To begin today's conversation, I'm happy to hand things over to JDCA's CEO, Haley Sofer, who will begin today's conversation. Haley, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ada, and thank you, Rabbi Sharon, for joining us all today. Tomorrow, it will have been exactly 2 months to the day since Hamas's brutal attack on Israel. These past 2 months have been incredibly difficult, not just, of course, for Israelis, but also for American Jews and Jewish communities throughout the world. Rabbi, how have the events of October 7th changed the way you approach your work as a Jewish spiritual leader, not just for the IKAR community, but for all Jews?
First of all, Haley, thank you. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. And thank you to my dear Ada for that beautiful intro, and Bobby for bringing this together in this way. I'm sorry, I'll miss speaking with the governor, who I was so looking forward to being in conversation with, but glad that you'll all get to hear from him next week. So something I've become very aware of in the last 2 months is that old motto that originally started out speaking about journalism, but I think many clergy have also adopted this, that the work before us is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. It really rings true for me all the time, but especially in the last 2 months. I think that the work has been first and foremost pastoral. We have had to deal with grief, anguish, shock, and horror as we witnessed the assaults on October 7th. I remember just a couple of days after, I think it was Monday night after the attacks on Shabbat, we had an event at IKAR just to bring people together to hold one another in grief. And at the last minute, we put up a board, and we wrote on it, "I'm holding in my heart ... with a basket of magic markers." And just thought maybe people would come up and add a name or a thought. And within a few minutes, the whole board was populated with names of friends and family members in Israel, some of whom already we knew had been murdered, some of whom had been taken captive. And I realized in that moment how deeply bound up in one another our communities really are. I think that we often think that these 2 great population centers of Jews, the state of Israel and the Jews living in the United States, are, we talk a lot about the fraying edges of these relationships, the ways in which we're really not ideologically aligned in many ways, the majority of Israeli Jews with the majority of American Jews. But we're family. We're family. And I saw it and I felt it deeply that day. And I've seen it every day since. We started to run lists of every person in our community that we could think of who either was Israeli or had immediate family in Israel, so that we could call and check in on them. And there's been this, we had 2 families, actually 2 of my board members had family members who were in captivity from Kibbutz Be'eri. I'm certain that you've all heard about Abigail, Liz Hirsch Naftali's niece Smadar was murdered along with her husband Ro'i, and the children 6 and 10 survived by hiding in the closet. And little Abigail, who was 3 years old at the time, escaped and ran to the neighbor's house and was taken into captivity. So this is very close to home for us. This is our family. We have another family that the entire family was abducted, and thank God, was released during this last round of hostage release. So the first piece of the work is really pastoral, both for those who have immediate connection, and also just for everybody who's experiencing a sense of shock and anguish, the rawness of the realization of the vulnerability that we all are experiencing right now. The second piece of the work is to, with a great pastoral sensitivity, hopefully, to move us from comforting the afflicted to afflicting the comfortable, to recognizing that we are naturally tribal, that we know and understand that this is biological, that people attach to tribes. We attach to tribes that look like us, pray like us, vote like us, talk like us. And there's something very powerful about tribal attachment. We need relationships and human connection and community in order to survive and thrive in the world. But we also know that the depth of our connection and our rootedness to our tribe has an inverse relationship to the depth of our connection and relatedness to people outside our tribe. So the more deeply entrenched we are in our own personal narratives and in our own personal suffering, the less likely we are to feel empathy for people who we consider outside our tribe. This is the afflicting the comfortable part of it. And nobody's really comfortable in this moment, so it doesn't exactly fit, but it's afflicting the uncomfortable a little bit, that we have to push ourselves beyond our natural inclination right now, which is to lick our wounds and really focus on our own fear and pain, which is very real, and also extend our hearts and hold compassion for the humanity of the people of Gaza who are suffering terribly right now, and also, frankly, for the Palestinians in the West Bank, who have also seen incredible loss over the last 2 months. And how do you hold both of those things in a world that has essentially created a false binary, a false calculation in which you either love this and hate that, or love this and hate that? And I'm suggesting that the spiritual work of our time is to love both, is to feel deeply rooted and entrenched in our Jewish narrative, to be absolutely brokenhearted, to stand in sorrow and solidarity with our Jewish family, and also to recognize the humanity of the people who are on the other side of this conflict, because ultimately the only way that this resolves is together. And that's political work, but that's also spiritual and cultural work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the hostages. They are always front and center for us. We are thinking of those that are still being held captive. Specifically, the concept of redeeming the hostages or redeeming the captives, it's one of the most important mitzvot in our tradition. And now we all may see in our weekly and our daily services that a prayer for the captives has been added. What does it say about Judaism that this concept is so central? And what does it say about the value that Jews place on each individual life?
It's an interesting question, Haley. On Shabbat morning, October 7th, when I walked into services, and I had just heard about what happened because a neighbor came to tell me what was going on, because we're offline on Shabbat. And I walked into services and we were all totally shaken up and weeping. And we had heard already that there had been mass abductions and that many people had been taken captive. And one of my congregants, Hannah Roth, brilliant, very brilliant woman whose family's in Israel, actually. Her brother is a rabbi who's a peacemaker in Israel. And Hannah handed me the Siddur open to the page with the prayer for the captives. And my hands were shaking as I read this prayer, because I realized that I had never, frankly, noticed it in our Siddur before. And yet it was there, which points to two truths. Number one, this is not new for the Jewish people. As much as this moment is different from anything we've ever experienced in our lifetime, there's an ancient prayer that Jews have for what to do when our people are captives. There are debates about what to do when our people are held captive in the Talmud and throughout the codes written in the Middle Ages. This is something that's known to the Jewish people, and the fact that we actually had a prayer for the captives really, it both connected me to our history, that this moment, it does not stand in isolation, but is part of a narrative thread over the course of many generations. It gave me a little bit of hope, because written into the language of the prayer for the captives is the language of sason v'simcha, which you might hear in that echoes of the Sheva Brachot from the wedding blessings that we say. There's this idea that even in the darkest moments, the worst possible moment, and some of our rabbis say that being in captivity is worse than being murdered, because you have to assume that what is happening to people in captivity is beyond our imagination of evil and horror. And even when we're confronted with that reality, we're still praying for, and therefore lifting our gaze toward and dreaming toward sason v'simcha, a time when there'll be joy again, when there'll be healing, when we'll be able to move through this and enter the next chapter. So that was very heartening and hopeful, at the same time that it was devastating, because you realize you're part of this long chain, this thread of tradition. And it also points to, as you suggested, the sanctity, the integrity, the dignity of every single individual human being. So something that we talk a lot about in our circles is that the first thing that we learn about human beings in the beginning of the book of Genesis is that every one of us is created b'tselem Elohim, that we are created in God's own image. And the rabbis in the Mishnah expound on that idea to say that the reason that God started with only one in the beginning was to teach us that every single human life has innate dignity, that we all have, in the language of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, in infinite worth. Every single human being has inestimable worth. So if you destroy one single human life, you're destroying a world, that we are all fundamentally equal to one another, and that every one of us has a unique voice, a unique role to play in this world. That's the very heart of my faith. That's the heart of my activism. It's the heart of my Jewish life. It's the heart of our IKAR community. And so now translate that to this moment of anguish and horror and upheaval. And what does it mean that there are still 137 or 138 people who remain in captivity in this moment? And how far do you go to save the life of any one of those people? And the answer is you do anything in the world to save the life of a human being, because every single person has infinite worth. I'm saying this now because in Israeli society right now, there's a real moral question that has emerged about how far the government of Israel is expected to go in order to redeem these captives. From our tradition, it's very clear that this is of the utmost importance, that we do everything in our power to do so. And now we have to look at all of the kind of military and diplomatic considerations that they're talking about in light of that very core spiritual, religious, and moral imperative that we do everything in our power to save the life of any single individual person. And I just want to add one more layer of complication, because we're Jews. The Mishnah does not say that every single Jewish life is worth a world. It says that every single human being is worth a world. And I think that's really critical for us to remember too. And I know it's really hard to talk about this in wartime, especially when our people have been the victims of such horrific atrocities. But it's imperative that we know and remember that every single Palestinian life is also worth a world, and that we not take lightly what it means that there have been already thousands of Palestinians, thousands of civilians who have died in a population that is 50% of which is under the age of 18. And so this calculation about the dignity of every person created in God's own image has to be at the forefront of our minds, of our moral imagination, and of our community organizing, even in these very difficult days.
Well, picking up on that, you had mentioned this Jewish concept of elu ve'elu, holding multiple truths at the same time. And since October 7th, you have condemned, of course, unequivocally, the barbarism and horror of Hamas's terrorist attacks and human rights abuses on Israelis. You've also decried rising anti-Semitism, condemned rising Islamophobia, and called for humanitarian aid for innocent Palestinians, as has JDCA. So 2 questions stemming from that. How do we effectively hold these multiple truths at once, recognizing that support for Israel and defense of Palestinian human rights, of course, distinguishing between Palestinians and Hamas, but defense of Palestinian human rights, these do not have to be a binary choice? First question. And second question is, what do you say to progressive groups that don't appear to be able to hold multiple truths at once and are noticeably absent, or at least not aligned with Israel against the terrorists that attacked it?
So to the first question about the binaries, not only do I believe that it's not binary, I think it cannot be binary. I really listen to and take great inspiration from the Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the West Bank who are part of the movement towards shared society and just future. Many of you probably heard from Alon Lee Green and Sally Abed from Omdim Biachad, from Standing Together. When they came, they just did a little East Coast tour, and they're going to be back to come back to the US in a couple of months. But there's a very strong voice in civil society, a very beautiful and rich and growing voice in Israeli civil society that is saying, we cannot choose to be pro this and anti this, or pro this and anti that. The only future is a future in which we're able to live side by side. Now, the voices at my kids' college campus and the voices on the street are not playing by those rules. These are voices that are amplifying some of the most extreme and radical views that are coming out of the region. And it's really dangerous. And it's also obviously really uncomfortable and even threatening for many of us who are living here. I think that we cannot and must not downplay the seriousness of what we're seeing on the college campuses, of what we're seeing at Goldie's in Philadelphia, a Jewish-owned restaurant being targeted with people who are raising the slogans of Hamas in the aftermath of Hamas atrocities. I mean, this is something that has to be taken very, very seriously. So even though I'm sad that the governor's not here with us for this conversation, I'm thrilled that he's actually going there, and that's actually a very good use of his time. We have to take this very seriously. It's extremely dangerous. But what I want to point out is that the voices, by and large, that we're hearing in these protests, and there have been, as we saw in the press yesterday, 600,000 people have taken in America to the streets in pro-Palestine protests, and 300,000 in pro-Israel protests. I think that some of the people in those pro-Palestine protests are not protesting for Palestinian liberation. They're protesting for the eradication of Jews from the region. And that is a very dangerous confluence, because we actually have to support the liberation of the Palestinian people. We have to fight for the liberation of the Palestinian people, for a just society, for a shared future where Jews and Palestinians can be neighbors, can work together, and can live together. We obviously have to fight against any movement that is pursuing an agenda that calls for the eradication of the Jews from the region, or, as is happening with increasing regularity now, the eradication of the Jews from the world. I'm pointing to, obviously, in Sydney, Australia, within 24 hours of the massacres, there were thousands of people chanting "Gas the Jews" on the campus, Holocaust 2.0, and all kinds of other things that we've all seen and heard about. So what we actually need to do is separate out and the movement for the eradication of Jews from the region which is a movement of genocidal intent, is obviously something that needs to be condemned. But the movement for the liberation of the Palestinian people and for justice for the Palestinian people is something that we as American Jews need to be calling for with a strong Jewish moral voice. And that's something that I and we and others have been saying and need to be saying louder. And even in this time when it's really hard to do that, we have to say these things are not in conflict. If there is going to be the future of a Jewish state, it has to be because there is also liberation and freedom for the and justice for the Palestinian people. So I have seen, Haley, in the last couple of months, and I'm sure you've seen this too, in ways that really surprised me and frankly have lifted my spirits, more people talking about a two-state solution now than I've heard in the last 10 years, right? In many of our circles, you know, when you say two-state solution, people would sort of like shrug and say, you know, the time has passed, that opportunity's gone, which is, I think, a great cause for worry and despair. But now people are talking about it again and saying, we have to resolve this. There has to be a just resolution to this conflict, because at the end of the day, all liberation is collective liberation, and Jews cannot be free until Palestinians are free. And to answer the second part of your question, what do I say to the people who don't see Jewish life as valuable, who don't see that my very existence, or frankly, my family's existence in Israel is justified in any way? I say to them the same thing, which is there is no anti-racist movement that's racist against Jews. There is no movement for liberation of impacted and oppressed and vulnerable people that does not also include the liberation of the Jewish people. And so this false binary, the language of the false binaries has to be broken down. The only way that any of us will be free is when all of us are free together. And we have to see ourselves as knitted into the fabric of humanity, even when we're feeling hurt, anguished, lonely. Ultimately, we have to build a just society here and there together.
So yesterday, the New York Times wrote a very important piece. I encourage everyone to read it, about the generational divide playing out within the American Jewish community regarding U.S. policy toward Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. It illustrated the divide that exists between boomers and Gen Xers versus millennials and Gen Z, and how we see Israel. What is your read of this divide in our community? What do you say to parents whose Jewish children may be among or aligned with those 600,000 that you referenced joining those pro-Palestinian protests? And what are the political implications of the divide within our community?
Yeah, this is an excellent piece. So thank you for lifting it up. And my Emma Goldberg, who wrote the piece, an excellent journalist and one of my dearest friends' daughters. And so I'm of course talking about our beloved Shifra Bronsnick. I know she has many fans on this call, of course, at JDCA. So I was very taken. Actually, Ada mentioned earlier that I did a conversation with Ezra Klein, and one of the things I was most taken by was his introduction to that conversation, in which he talked also about this generational divide. And there was something about the way that he laid it out that really struck me, because we've been talking for years. I mean, Yossi Klein Halevi's been beating this drum for years, talking about the way, you know, the sort of pre-67 mentality and the post-67 and the pre-intifada and post-intifada. And so let me just share the paradigm here for a moment, and then I'll get to answer your question about how we talk to each other in our families, because I don't know of many families where there isn't some kind of divide here on the way that we look at this conflict. What Ezra was referring to is the analysis now that there's an older generation of Jews who look at this, who look at Israel and see Israel as the David to the Goliath of the Arab world. And, you know, the kind of underdog, and in many ways, like the heroic underdog, because of the very fact of our fight for our own survival in a post-Holocaust world. And then there's a generation of people who saw Israel, and I would consider myself in this generation, as increasingly powerful and always striving for peace. So increasingly powerful with an occupation over Palestinian people that it didn't want to be occupying. So trying in many different ways to create a peace process that would give Palestinians their autonomy and the opportunity for self-determination, a two-state solution. And I really very much identify with that era. That's when I spent time in Israel in the 90s and the Oslo years. That was when I was, both in college and in rabbinical school. And then he says there's another generation which grew up with Israel now firmly entrenched in the position of Goliath and not striving for peace, not fighting to get back to that table, not interested in hearing what the Arab peace plan might look like and then using that as a starting point and working in negotiations, but instead in investing in and entrenching in an increasingly hardlined, messianic, ultra-nationalist Israel and set of Israeli policies. That's sort of at the heart of the generational divide right now. It's not just that Israel has had the power, because frankly, for 2 generations, Israel's had the power. It's that Israel had the power and was striving for peace in my formative years. And Israel does not appear to be striving for peace now, but instead moving in the other direction, planting more settlements, empowering messianic leadership in the Knesset. And this is why Israelis, for the last year, have been taking to the streets, hundreds of thousands of them, week after week after week, saying, hold on a minute, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, these guys don't represent the Israel that I fought and was willing to die for. They don't represent the Israel that is, a Western, liberal Western democracy that values equity and equality and justice and dignity, that's striving toward peace. So I'm not suggesting that Israeli society has made this move, but Israel's government certainly has made that move to the right. And so young people who are growing up with that reality look at, they just read the news. And many of them are saying, I don't identify with these values. This government is anathema to my values. And it's not just the last year. It's the last 20 years that it's been moving in this direction. So how do we talk to each other given that reality? So I imagine a Venn diagram, and like these sort of overlapping circles. And there are certainly the outer edges of all of our ideas that might really come into conflict with our family members, whether it's generational or not. For some people, it's their siblings are a little, are further to the right or further to the left. By the way, for some people, their children are further to the right than the parents, depending on how, which day school you send them to. And so in all these cases, what I envision us doing is like actually drawing in our minds a Venn diagram. And instead of sitting down at the table and starting with the extremes where we don't see the world the same way, looking at the core, the overlapping values, where we both can say, okay, I care deeply about human life. So do I. Great. That's a good starting point. Now let's have the first, now we can sit down and have this, say motzi and have our first piece of challah. Now, what else do we hold in that Venn diagram? I'm really concerned about a growing antisemitism and want Jews to be safe. So do I. Great. Now we can have a soup together, and like with each course, as we move through the evening, let's talk about the things that the values, not the policies, but the values that we actually hold. And I think what we'll see is that there are many things, even with this generational divide, that we actually agree upon. In Emma's story in the New York Times, that 31-year-old living in Brooklyn actually has from a value standpoint, has a lot in common with her brother and sister-in-law and her parents. I think the problem with the conversation is that it starts at the outer edges where they don't see eye to eye. And the goal here is to really find our way to one another's hearts, to actually find ways in which we can rehumanize one another in this moment of such anguish, where what we're experiencing a kind of repulsion from each other. And so how do we start to come a little bit closer to one another and see each other in our pain, and see each other in our humanity, and hold each other's aspirations with love and with care, even ultimately when we don't see it exactly the same way?
Thank you so much for that. Okay, going back to your podcast with Ezra Klein, it was called Sermons I Need to Hear Right Now. Clearly, he titled it after hearing you speak. I think all of us are thinking very similarly about this event. In addition to that podcast, you recently gave a sermon focused on the deafening silence of the international community following Hamas's unconscionable and horrifying use of sexual violence as an act of war. And this is something that JDCA has advocated on as well, because there has been now in 8+ weeks, very little response, a tepid response from the international community. It took the UN Secretary General over 50 days to condemn it. UN Women had tweeted out a condemnation and they deleted the tweet. And only 8 weeks and 1 day, and yes, we were counting, after the attack, did they finally condemn it. And clearly, international organizations are still questioning the veracity of these reports, where far, far, far too many of the victims cannot speak for themselves. They have been murdered. They are being held hostage. So we need to speak for them. What do you make of the controversy, specifically following the international community's failure to acknowledge and condemn these mass atrocities targeting women? And what can we all do to make sure Hamas is held accountable for these crimes against humanity?
So this is one of the most painful aspects of this. I mean, we started hearing stories about rape and gender-based violence immediately. We saw images and heard stories immediately. And I think that this points to a really profound moral failure among many of the people in the movements for social justice and for human rights, many of the people who vote, like a lot of the people on this webinar today. And it's really painful. It's painful to see the equivocation. It's painful to see and hear really strong, powerful women who care a lot about women's rights and human rights, who can't simply say it is never okay to use rape as a tool of war. It is simply never acceptable to do that. So the failure of others to condemn in this moment is painful. And I think we have to be really clear about that. It's a real pain point. And when this war is over, and God willing, it will be soon, there are going to be some very hard conversations that we who are in this work need to have with our colleagues and friends and allies, and really try to understand why it was so hard for so many people to simply unequivocally condemn the atrocities that we saw on October 7th. In the meantime, our work is to support the survivors. Our work is to believe the survivors. I gave a sermon right after, I think it was the first Shabbat after October 7th, in which I said, just because the world's lost their damn minds, we have to not lose our damn minds. And I believe that. I mean, I think that other people
put that on a shirt.
I didn't plan on saying it, but as I was speaking, it kind of came through me, and I thought, okay, I can stand by that. It's always dangerous to speak off the cuff when people are actually listening, but I keep coming back to that because I think I'm so sick over it. I mean, I've watched these interviews with some of the women who I've helped get elected, who can't simply say, this is a disgrace and an outrage. No person should be put through what these women and girls were put through, but they can't muster it because it's complicated, because they're Israeli, and because they're Jews who are in Israel, and that makes them settler colonialists somehow. So I think what I want to keep reminding us is, just because people have lost their damn minds does not mean that we should. We still know what's right and what's wrong. We know. And so we have to continue to live in the world based on our moral code. That is imperative in this time. And it's painful and it hurts, but life hurts, okay? Like life isn't easy for anyone. The challenge that Jews are carrying around right now is in addition to our anguish, our grief, our sorrow, also a sense of existential loneliness, also a sense of betrayal from our friends and allies, and also fear for ourselves and for our children. All of that is just part of the reality of this time. And that cannot change who we are fundamentally. People ask me all the time, so what are you going to do, like with regards to BLM now? Are you going to go out and protest next time there's a big protest for racial justice? And my answer is our work in the world has never been conditional on other people being good to us. The reason that Jews take to the street to fight for racial justice, for climate justice, for reproductive justice has never been because we expect then that other people will show up for us, or because it's always been because these are our core values, and they're still our core values. And so we have to continue to be driven by that. And Haley, I want to add one more thing, because I feel this is a really critical piece. And it's a little bit related to my book that's coming out in just a month, a book which I wrote. I closed the manuscript over a year ago. I went into the studio to read for the audiobook last month, and it was really my first time kind of revisiting my words post October 7th. And I felt as I was reading it that without knowing it, I wrote the book for this time. I thought I was writing the book for that time, but the book is more the idea of the book is more relevant now than it was before, because part of the essence of this conversation is exactly what you've been asking, which is, how do we find our way to one another, whether the other is in our family or our allies in the work, or others in our party or in our political movement, or the professors and fellow students on campus? How do we find our way to each other when we are seeing the world from totally different vantage points? And my argument in the book is that we have to cultivate a sense of curiosity and wonder in a moment in which our hearts want to shut down because we're in pain. And when we are hurting, we retreat from the world. We don't move closer. We have to step closer to each other, and we have to do it in the form of a question. Tell me your story. Help me understand your perspective. Help me see the world through your eyes, not because I think you're more right than I am, but because the only way we're going to get through this is through reaffirming one another's humanity. And when I awaken myself to your humanity, I'm also growing as a human being myself, and I'm reawakening my own. So I feel that part of this, what this is all about, is instead of, we have to care for ourselves and we have to be in Shiva. We have to, like when you're really grieving, we move close in and we let people make us dinner and, just sit with us quietly and cry. But you can't stay in Shiva forever. At some point after the week's over, you get up and you walk around the block and you say, I'm still mourning, but there's a whole world out there, and I've got to figure out how to be in relationship with the rest of the world now. And I don't know when that's going to be for each one of us. It might be a different time. I mean, some of us are ready to be back in the world again. Some of us, it might be a few more months or a year, depending on how traumatized we are and how much, we have in us that we're able to move in that direction. But you can't live as an island forever. At some point, you have to start to build bridges to the mainland, even though you're hurt and wounded and upset. And that's going to mean going back to confront the people who've caused us pain or who see things differently than we do, and asking, tell me about what was going on for you during this time, and let me tell you what I was experiencing. And those are really hard conversations, but ultimately are necessary conversations for us to be able to begin to mend what's been broken here.
I'm glad you mentioned your book, again, called the Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Mend Our Broken Hearts and World. So since it is available in pre-order, I'm doing the math here, you must have written the bulk of it prior to October 7th. But at this point, we may need some additional mending in ways even you perhaps could not have foreseen. How did you have to change your book, if at all, after October 7th?
Well, so the manuscript has been locked for over a year. So there are no changes to the book. And that's, what changes is the conversation around the book. And I'm going to share with you the sort of central paradigm of the book, because it'll help you understand my answer to this question. The whole book is essentially rooted in one central image, which comes from a Mishnah, from this ancient Jewish code of law. It comes from Tractate Midot. It's kind of an obscure tractate. The context is terse laws about the architectural framework of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So what the text says, and I essentially encountered this text in rabbinical school, didn't understand it, came out to LA, built IKAR, named a lot of babies, buried a lot of people, married a lot of people, helped people through divorce, and then re-encountered the text. And what the text says is that in the old days, hundreds of thousands of Jews would ascend to Jerusalem and then ascend the steps of the temple to the Har HaBayit, to the Temple Mount. And then they would enter through this giant entryway, and they would turn to the right, and they would circle around the perimeter of the courtyard. And then they would basically exit right where they had entered. Except the text says, someone to whom something had happened, someone who is brokenhearted. That person would go in and go to the left, and everyone else is going to the right. And what would happen is they would encounter each other. And the people who are coming from the right, every one of them would have to stop and ask, Malach, what happened to you? Tell me your story. And the person who's brokenhearted would say, Ani Avel, I am a mourner. I just lost a loved one. I'm worried sick about my kid. I found a lump. I'm scared. And every single person who's going this way, before they could go on, would have to stop and offer this person a blessing. And so the reason I fell in love with this Mishnah, once I understood what it actually was trying to say to us, is because I think the rabbis have this incredibly deep, profound psychological insight that when we're broken and bereaved, the last thing in the world we want to do is show up in a place with hundreds of thousands of people and wave a flag saying, I'm different from you. Most of us would stay home and curl up in a ball. Some of us would go and pretend we're okay, even though we're not okay. But the rabbis say sometimes you're walking in one direction and the whole world in another, and it's okay. And what we have to do is cultivate communities where when we're walking in the other direction, the community can stop and see us and say, I see you, tell me your story, and then offer a blessing. This is essentially the meaning of Amen. I see your pain. Amen, amen, amen. And so part of what's changed for me since I wrote the book, I wrote it really as a pastor, as a rabbi who's walked with a lot of people through very deep grief and really traumatic and tragic loss. And then, closed the manuscript, and my father died at the end of August, just before Rosh Hashanah. And so I basically wrote the book oriented this way and read the book oriented that way. I wrote the book as a Jew in a community that, even though since Charlottesville, we've seen this massive spike in anti-Semitism in America and great grave threats of political violence infused with anti-Semitism, I essentially felt safe as a Jew in America and felt like I was more in the position of right to left, like I'm going to show up as an ally. I'm going to be the best damn ally I can be. And then all of a sudden, post October 7th, feel like, oh, we're actually in grave danger now. And am I safe? And are my children safe? And so in many ways, my vantage point has shifted since I wrote the book to when the book is actually coming out into the world. And it holds up, thankfully. I was a little nervous about how it would feel to read it now from the other vantage point. But the thing is, it's ancient wisdom. It's not my wisdom. It's ancient wisdom. The rabbis knew what they were talking about. And 2,000 years ago, they crafted a system that would teach this side about compassionate loving engagement of someone in need, and teach this side about strong, courageous, honest presence when we're in pain. And those things haven't changed over the last 2,000 years, and they haven't changed over the last 2 months. So it's my hope that this idea, this paradigm, this precious treasure from the past will help open up the possibility of healing for all of us, from whether our pain is personal and our grief is personal, like mine is and my family's is right now in this moment, or our pain is collective and communal and societal, like it is for all of us in this moment.
I have no doubt that it holds up. I look forward to reading it. It sounds like, similar to where we started talking about the prayer for the captives. I too didn't know it existed until my son was bar mitzvah the week after October 7th. And there was the prayer for the captives in the service and had additional meaning, but it was there for us when we needed it. Sounds like that is a core principle of this book. So amid the darkness of the past 2 months, there have still been some glimmers of light, and we'll all be reminded of that when we light the Hanukkah menorah starting tomorrow night. So as we close today's program, what gives you hope for the future? What are your glimmers of light? And what advice might you have for those of us who have not yet been able to get up from Shiva after October 7th?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So first, I just want to say, I've made a few visits down to Brian Stevenson's Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. If you haven't gone, you really must go and experience this. And essentially what he does is he, in a very honest narrative, really shows the journey from enslavement to Jim Crow and the era of racial terror to the era of mass incarceration in our time, all these different forms of controlling and containing Black bodies in America. And it's excruciating and so important for every American to experience. The reason I'm raising it now is because you walk through this devastating and very powerful museum, and on your way out, there's this little sign on the wall that you could actually miss right by the exit. And it just says hope. And I want to cry just thinking about it, because I remember feeling when I saw this the first time and then the second time, I remember thinking, if he can still have hope after really investing in all of the research and narrative and discourse that led to the creation of this, if he can still feel hope in America, how can we not? And I think the same is true here. So there are two things really that have given me hope in the last 2 months. The first is I love my Jewish community. I love our Jews. I really do. And I feel that we have, as I said earlier, we have this innate need to not go through hardship alone. And as alone as we feel in the world, there are other people who are also feeling alone. And when we find our way to each other, even 2 people or 10 people or 300 people, there's this sense of like, okay, I'm understood here. And so I, like, one person said to me in the one of the weeks right after October 7th, she said, I feel like this is the first environment I've been in since October 7th where I can just cry and not apologize for my tears and not have to say, I know it's complicated, but still I'm really sad that all these Jews were massacred. Like, and other people have said, like, I know that I just need to be around other people who understand that as much as I love my family in Israel, I'm also really sad about those babies in Gaza. Like, finding our way to each other, to the people who actually do see the world like we do, and just finding comfort in one another, because we need to be comforted. The second is, I mentioned earlier, the leaders of civil society in Israel. And I'm just going to lift up a few here as we close today, because I spoke in my sermon about women. I spoke about Vivian Silver from Women Wage Peace. Jewish, Palestinian, Bedouin, Druze women who are actually leading the discourse on peace right now. And what does it mean to be brave enough to actually talk about peace in a time of war, to encourage our people to lift our gaze and see what might be a future in this landscape of so much horror and so much pain. The work of standing together, Omdim Biyachad, these incredible Jewish Israeli and Palestinian citizens of Israel working together in civil society, the combatants for peace, the people who Colin McCann wrote about in a Paragon. These guys are still standing as brothers, fighting together for a different kind of future. And of course, the people of the Bereaved Families Forum, the Parents Circle, who've had the greatest loss of all, lost immediate family members, and are still saying we have to work together toward a different kind of future. If they can hold that hope, how can we not?
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with all of us, your insight, your sense of humanity, and of course, your wisdom with regard to Judaism. We love our Jews too. We love this community. We're grateful for convening each week, and we are so grateful that you joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you.
I will now turn it over to our new Leadership Council member, Emily Goodstein, to close today's event.
Thanks, Haley, and thank you, Rabbi Brous, and to everyone who tuned in today. In moments like this, it's more important than ever to hear from leaders who understand the complexities of these situations. We are appreciative to have the opportunity to hear from political and spiritual leaders, and are grateful to all of you for being part of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. As a member of JDCA's new Leadership Council, I should say proud member, I'm so inspired by what this organization has to offer to voters like me who are committed to electing Democrats who share our values. If you have also found your political home with JDCA and you have enjoyed these weekly convenings, please consider supporting the organization today at jewishdems.org. You can also check out the link in the chat, which I think will pop up there in a second, so we can continue to expand our efforts and lay the groundwork for Democratic wins in 2024. Next week, we invite you to join us for our next community briefing on the crisis in Israel and on the 7th day of Hanukkah with Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Yehuda Kurtzner, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, and acclaimed author and speechwriter and fellow JDCA new Leadership Council member, Sarah Hurwitz. To sign up, please click the link in the chat. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm wishing everyone a very happy Hanukkah tomorrow night. See you next week.